I can't exactly put my finger on why, but let's just say I think the top line might have gotten the message from last game. Winnipeg dominates Detroit. Find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are, celebrating after a huge Jets win. Let me tell you, I think the team might have gotten the message after the rough outing on Monday against Toronto. Winnipeg came back swinging with a vengeance. And not only that, but the top line actually led the way. A bit of a change of pace. The depth lines have typically been carrying Winnipeg so far this year, but in this game, finally, the top line showed that it could be a top line, when it really puts its mind to it and gets going. So very big game, a lot of fun, and we'll dive into some of the specifics about that in just a little bit. But before we go any further, did want to let you know that you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, big 6-2 victory, and the Jets really opened this game up basically swinging from puck drop. Winnipeg was up 3-0 before you even had time to really get settled in for the game. Obviously, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but the Jets ran the score up extremely quickly. Winnipeg, I think, really came out with a big statement. They wanted to prove that the last game against Toronto was not reflective of this team's ability. And so the top line immediately got on the board, Gabriel Vilardi scoring on a great feed from Kyle Connor. And then not too long after that, top line on again with Neal Pionk crashing the crease and scoring a tap-in on the far post. So very good stuff. And then as if things just weren't good enough, well, Kyle Connor then added Winnipeg's third goal of the period. It was one where the Jets just really ran everything. You really couldn't see too much that was going wrong for the Jets. Overall, just a really strong opening. And if you wanted a response after a game in which Winnipeg basically looked extremely sluggish, against Toronto, especially for the first two periods, well, this was exactly the kind of answer you needed. Winnipeg did well. They came out swinging. And I think it was the exact level of effort that Winnipeg, frankly, needed to have earlier this week. But you know what? Better late than never. The second period was a little bit more of an issue just because the Jets got themselves into some penalty trouble. And the PK, which has actually been brilliant, it's ranked coming into this game, it was ranked fourth. Not quite sure where it is now, but they surrendered a couple of goals, and some of the calls were a little questionable. The Samberg interference one, I'm still just baffled by. I mean, it wasn't interference. He was just resetting to his point and somehow got called for a pick, I guess, which was kind of funny because Ehlers, I think, was actually getting hooked in front of the net, and that did not get called. So a little irritated by that. And then there was a later call, I think, on Pionk. He actually did kind of get that one, but it just felt like, at least for the first couple of penalty calls, the decision-making and justification was a little bit sketchy. So that really was the only sign of legitimate offense from Detroit. The Red Wings after that started to turn the tide of the game, and it felt like, Winnipeg was maybe starting to lose the grip on the game a bit. But then, towards the end of the period, it seemed like they stabilized things and maybe stemmed the bleeding a touch. And then once the third period started, Niederreiter scored a bit of a fluky one. He just sort of drove the net, one-handed the puck towards the crease. Lyon really didn't have a chance because Sherratt was there on the back end and just sort of deflected it home. And just like that, all of a sudden things were kind of tilting back towards Winnipeg's favor. And from there, the Jets added a second Neal Pionk goal, and then Colin Miller shot one that actually almost was this close to being a power play goal. So, Winnipeg basically came in and took care of business. Now, I would say the stars of the night, the top line, in particular, Kyle Connor, who you'll notice is a talking point later in this episode, because I think it's really worth spotlighting. Pionk also had a really fantastic game, and you'll see he and his partner Samberg are also a talking point, and I really feel like giving them some roses, because I know the last game for them was probably, for both players, among the worst outings of their careers. And if you wanted them to have a big response game, well, this was it. So all due credit to them. If there was anyone who really stood out as maybe struggling a bit, it was actually just two lines, the Nemestikov line and the Kupari line. Now, the Nemestikov line, it felt like Vlad just really hasn't been able to seize the 2C role this year. He just seems a step behind, and it feels like he's kind of fighting the puck right now, which wasn't a problem last year, but this season just feels like he's not been the same guy. The Kupari line, man, they just really had a rough evening. And I think Kupari in particular himself kind of showed why, in a lot of ways, he's still, a bit of a fourth liner. I felt like he had some really bad passes and decision-making, and it was just a tough outing for him. But it's been like one of the rare games where he's stood out in that way. Usually the fourth line really hasn't had any problems. So, again, every player goes through some rough spells, and this is just one game. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but the Nemestikov line is maybe a more longer-term issue and something that the Jets may want to address once the trade deadline rolls around. It is still a few months out, and there's always a chance Nemestikov or somebody else steps up and is able to seize that 2C role. But I think at some point, if Vlad isn't able to turn around his form, they may need to think about something, just because it does look like in this role he's a little overmatched at this point, which, again, last year wasn't a problem. This year, again, bit of a different story. So something to keep an eye on. But I would also say that this line was a little unlucky. Ehlers dished Perfetti a couple of great chances, and unfortunately, Perfetti hit the crossbar in a post, if I recall correctly. So very close to connecting, just not quite there for this line, which is fine. I mean, they've been pretty good the last few games, and so every once in a while you're going to have an off night, and that was that line's night tonight. But everyone else, I mean, the Jets generally controlled play. I mean, there really wasn't too much to be upset about. If there was one player who maybe stood out in the wrong way, I think Logan Stanley had another tough outing. This is probably some of the most that I've seen him struggle consistently. And I know he just came back from injury a few games ago, but I feel like even by his standards, this has been a rough spell. I think he's just fighting it a lot. And, with him kind of not looking that different when he's healthy, I do think it might be worth giving Fleury some games. I think Fleury and Miller actually looked really great as a pairing. And I know that Fleury is going to have his own, ups and downs. It's not like he's not prone to turnovers too, but I feel like that pairing was a lot more stable, and they were still able to make, zone exits relatively cleanly, enough to the point where I'd go back to that pairing. And I think, the Jets might be willing to consider that for the upcoming game against Columbus, because like the Blue Jackets, they've actually been winning quite a bit. So it wouldn't be bad if Fleury came back in and the Jets are able to make use of their depth. I know Stanley is working hard and he's trying, but I just feel like his start to the season has been, how do I put this kindly, very inauspicious. There was one particular extended sequence tonight where he got pinned, he was tired, and he had like 3, I think, zone clearance or zone exit attempts that were failed. Garrett Hull was doing the tracking. So if you ever want to know what he's kind of looking at in some of these zone tracking stuff, especially like the microstats tracking, he does a great job kind of laying out who's doing well and who's maybe struggling. And, it's very helpful just to get a quick, bit of a slice of how a game's going for a player. And I think in Stanley's case, you could kind of see it visually. There were some bad passes and turnovers, and it continues a trend with him. I know, again, he's really trying to, be an important part of this team. But I think at this point, you kind of see why a lot of us have suggested bringing somebody else in for that role. So Heinola, he is skating again. He should be back in the next few weeks at some point. So that, I think, would be a nice boost for Winnipeg's back end. But in the meantime, wouldn't mind giving some games to Fleury. But overall, big 6-2 victory. Very happy with this game. I think the Jets can be happy too. Detroit wasn't like the craziest opponent, but all the same, you don't get to pick your opponents. You've still got to show up and do the job. And the Jets did exactly that and generally dominated the game. That's exactly what you want to see. And especially from who it was coming from, I think was important, especially for the first line that frankly did need to answer some of us critics. So big game. And I really want to give a particular player from the first line his roses. Not that Velarde and Scheifele didn't contribute. They absolutely did. But I think tonight's first star for me was Kyle Connor, who I think showed up in a really impressive way. And I want to talk about his start to the season because I think it's worth giving some time to individually for a player who, quite frankly, has been maligned in a lot of ways because he hasn't been this level of player for much of his career. But we'll chat about that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to call out our friends and partners at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports available to everyone. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long on PrizePicks. Now, for those of you who are wondering why you should go with PrizePicks, they always put their members first, so all withdrawals are safe, fast, and secure. When your picks hit, you can even get your money in as little as 15 minutes. And they even offer Venmo for quick and easy deposits and withdrawals into your account, so you can always stay plugged into the action as quickly as possible. And if your lineup maybe has an issue, maybe somebody gets injured and you're a little bit freaked out about it, don't worry. They've got an injury insurance policy. Your lineup will stay live even if somebody leaves mid-game. For those of you who sign up today, you'll even get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's just guaranteed with your first $5 play. If you think that maybe Mark Scheifele will have plus 2.5 points or something in his next game against Columbus, maybe you want to put some money down on that. Maybe you think Ehlers will, come back after having no points in tonight's game. Either way, be sure to drop your bet with PrizePicks, and you can do so by downloading the app today and using code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about, some interesting stuff coming from the start of the season. The Jets are now 9-1-0. How awesome is that? Top of the league, and things are feeling pretty good. Somehow the Jets, against all odds, and despite playing maybe not their most well-rounded game this season, on the whole, there's a style of hockey that they're playing that's maybe not sustainable, but they've still managed to climb to first. And it just tells you that the ceiling for this team, if they start to maybe round out some of those rough edges, really could look really impressive, especially if the top line kind of sorts things out. And that's one group I want to talk about in particular is the top line. It's been the subject of a lot of, speculation and criticism. And I think, it's not just coming from us fans. Even the coaching staff has kind of looked at this group and probably said, not really seeing what we want out of this unit. I think in the last game, them getting broken up, and in a prior game, they sat a shift. Maybe these moves don't last necessarily, but I think the fact that they're being made not even 10 games into the season kind of tells you that our Neal is maybe more aware of the problems than we give him credit for. I know that I've personally said, what's the coaching staff doing? It's frustrating. Why'd they go back? And I think to some degree, they're trying to balance personalities and egos. There's probably also some stuff from the front office where they kind of want to have things their way, and they want to satisfy their star players who have committed to staying here. And Connor and Scheifele probably fit the mold there, and so I get it from that perspective. But like I said, I think at some point somebody's got to put on the adult pants and kind of make the difficult decision. But in this case, I think the Jets definitely got the message across because the first line played arguably its best and most complete game of the season. And the guy who really drove that bus was Kyle Connor. Connor has had a very fun start to the year. Look, he will always have some of those defensive warts, and he'll have moments where you kind of see him with some of his old struggles. But I think the amount of defensive commitment that he's shown this year and his offensive jump to his game, where he's been more of a creator overall, just a really versatile player, is a welcome change. It's something that we haven't really seen a lot from him. He's been more physical. He's winning battles in the corners. He's forced turnovers. This is all stuff that, quite frankly, wasn't a feature of his game in previous years. And to see him actually do it now, I think just it sort of warms this old heart. I've been hard on him before. I've said that, in terms of players on this team who are, perhaps the most expendable, so to speak, in your top six, Connor has kind of flirted with that territory because, he was giving up so much more than he was giving the Jets. And I think it was a difficult, consideration about his long-term future here. And I still think at the end of it, I don't know if I'd really want to sign a big contract extension just because he'll be closer to 30. And, as you age out, it's a little hard to repeat this level of success. But I would say for the time being, for while he's here, he has been the best player on his line. He's been the best forechecker. And, while Scheifele and Velarde have kind of gone in and out of being decent, while also having, some pretty notable struggles in other games, it's been Connor who I think has stood out the most on a routine basis. And again, this is not a game style that we've seen from him before. He's played a much more well-rounded 100-foot game. And it's not, 200-foot game. It's not perfect. He still has those warts and it's never going to change, but at least he's making the effort. And I think it's really had an impact on his overall level of play. And honestly, the points are starting to flow for him. I've really felt like his performance the past two games is very worth celebrating. I think he had his 500th point in Detroit, which is great. A huge outing for him, 3 points, and he got 501 and 502 as well. And it couldn't happen to somebody who I think deserves it more this season. He's really busted his butt off. And you look at his points totals so far this year, he's almost up to 2 points per game. And it's not like it's been empty calorie stuff. He's really been fighting for his scoring record. I know it hasn't all come at 5v5, but, even in the games where he's scoring on the power play and stuff, he's still doing so much off the puck more than he was in previous years. To where you just have to really give him his roses and applaud his efforts. I really feel like he deserves it. He's been great. And, if there's one forward on that line who's really stood out positively to me, it's KFC. He's been the best version of himself that we've seen. And it kind of continues from a trend from the end of last season that we saw. It seemed like he was starting to buy into Bones' system a little more. And so far, that has really translated to his start to the year under Neal. His line mates, it's been a little more questionable. I know that they're also kind of pacing at pretty big scoring rates, Scheifele especially, but I just feel like Mark just looks a step behind this year. I don't know what's changed for him, but it just doesn't seem like he's winning as many battles. He looks a little bit sluggish, and he just hasn't been winning as many of his duels. He's still scoring a lot, which is great. No complaints about that, but I feel like the overall game and skating speed and stuff, he just hasn't looked like the usual Mark Scheifele that we associate with him. And it's strange to say because he's got 13 points, but I think the way that he's maybe come about those, it does leave some questions for me. So something to keep an eye on. There's a version of Scheifele that I've always said is much better than what we've seen the past few years. And I know that there's a special player inside of him that can sometimes pop up when he starts to dominate, but it's been a little bit strange to say that we haven't seen as much of that recently. So curious to know if that continues this year. Winnipeg really does need him to step up in a big way because, quite honestly, he is one of our most important players. And the Jets, quite frankly, also need more out of Velarde. He's been a little bit on and off. The past couple of games, he has had 4 points, so that's cool. But on the whole, Velarde has sort of been a little up and down to start the season. It's notable that Connor and specifically Connor has stood out positively, while Scheifele and Velarde have maybe not been as positively noticeable on their lines. So, something to keep an eye on again. But I think with Velarde, I worry less about the effort and more just a question of the line fit. I think if you got him away from Scheifele and Connor, he'd probably start to put more consistently effective performances together. So with him, I'm not so worried. With Scheifele, I do wonder if there's something kind of underlying all of that. So bigger questions for the Jets, but for one game at least, the top line really played like the top line, and Kyle Connor absolutely deserves a huge chunk of that credit for this particular performance. But, he's not the only guy who I think has really answered the call. Obviously, earlier in the show, I did mention that a particular D pairing has stood out positively after the worst game these guys have ever played together against Toronto. Samberg and Pionk rebounded in a big way. And I was really in favor of keeping this pairing together. Strange to say it, but this year I think that they're the most heavily used pairing that I trust the most. Morrissey and DeMello have struggled together this year, and I think DeMello just looks a really big step behind. But Samberg and Pionk have kind of been able to carry the load. I mean, they've been, aside from last game, really good together. And again tonight, they kind of showed why sometimes you do need to be a little bit patient and just kind of let them work through some nights where maybe they just don't have it. Pionk had one of his finest games, a 2-goal evening, and was one of the top offensive threats for the Jets in this one. And we'll chat about why this pairing has maybe worked a little bit better in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to say thanks to our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL and all other sports all in one place. If you're maybe a Ravens fan or a Vikings fan, perhaps you're a Commanders fan too, you're getting a hunch about one of these teams maybe making a real deep playoff run, now would be a good time to get in on the action and place those bets with FanDuel. Or maybe you're thinking a little more, micro scale in the short term. Maybe you're just in the middle of the game and you're getting a bit of a hunch about who's going to score next, who might win, yada, yada, yada. Well, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And again, don't forget, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's all at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with a little bit of praise for the Samberg-Pionk pairing. And I know, this was not a pairing that I think I had a lot of faith coming into the season with. I was worried that they were going to struggle. I thought, given the last years and the priors, would we really see them rebound? It was kind of a question of, would we see Pionk be able to turn it around? Because I really didn't have questions about Samberg so much, but Pionk, when he tries to defend a little more, I think that actually works against him. Pionk is at his best when he's allowed to essentially roam as a fourth forward. When he's offensively engaged and attacking the OZ with the skillful skating and offensive acumen that he has, he's a very different player. And I think this year has seen him really be his most aggressive and ambitious. I don't know if Neal maybe took a cue from the Morrissey experiment last year, but it seems like I guess maybe 2 years ago now, but it seems like Pionk has been allowed to be more aggressive and attack the OZ deeper than he has in previous years. And it's really paid off. He has 12 points in 10 games. He's been a huge volume producer and really one of the biggest assets to Winnipeg's blue line this year, which is kind of strange to say because defensively, he still has plenty of those moments where you're maybe don't turn it over right in front of Hellebuck. But otherwise, his offensive game has so far outweighed his contributions negatively that you really can't, hate his performance so far. He's been pretty darn good. If you sort of ignore the last game, which was really just an anomaly for everyone, and Samberg included too, Pionk and Samberg have generally been fantastic together. They, like I said earlier, they are the deep pairing that gets the most ice time that I trust at this point. I think that they are the most heavily used pairing for Winnipeg that I feel comfortable with because Morrissey and DeMello haven't looked like they usually do. And so if I have to rank one of our pairings, they kind of come in first for me, Samberg and Pionk. And I feel like that's one of those reasons why I wasn't ready to split them up in this game. Now, if you do change the pairings, I would probably look at moving DeMello to the third pairing for now, especially once Heinola comes back. I just think that might help him out a little bit and maybe help him snap out of the funk that he's currently in. And then you could maybe do Morrissey Miller, because Miller's been fantastic for the Jets. He's been huge found money. He had a goal in this Red Wings game, and so glad that he's finally actually playing Jets games because last year he only played 5 games somehow. But I would probably think about keeping Samberg and Pionk together for now. I mean, until it stops working, I'm inclined to just lean on them. They've been good together. They generally give you more than they give up. And Samberg has been a really good partner for Neal because he's sort of the more details-oriented defender, and his skating and transition game are strong enough to where Neal can feel less pressure about having to race back and not being as aggressive. With Samberg, Dylan is good enough and fast enough to sort of cover up for when maybe Pionk gets a little too ambitious or the line in front of him makes a turnover or something. With Brendan Dillon, it wasn't as easy and as quick. Pionk maybe had to be a little less aggressive. Maybe he had to sit a little bit closer to the opposing blue line, less, but below the faceoff circle and stuff. But now that he can be that fourth forward, that roaming attacker, it's been a huge blessing for him and really for Winnipeg. And so this D pairing, I just think so long as it continues to do what it's been doing so far, just leave them together. They're kind of cooking, and I really don't have any complaints. Which is kind of funny because like Pionk in particular was probably my biggest worry this year on the blue line, and he's been anything but a concern. So, I think for the Jets, it's been great to see him. Big contract, real contract year, real deal Neal for Norris Pionk. I just hope he continues the success. If there's a player that I know has struggled in the past that I just genuinely consistently root for, it's Neal. He's always been one of those guys that I feel is a little more accountable when he's struggling. And, like I've constantly said, I felt really bad for him when he said his own performance was embarrassing. That was a couple of years ago now, but I always feel like he probably more than most knows where he's weakest and where he's really struggling. And, with the amount of ice time that he gets, I'm sure it's frustrating that he can't always make things work the way that he wants. So, overall, just a really strong year from Samberg and Pionk. I hope it continues. And once the Jets get some defensive reinforcements, I think it might be time to bring Heinola back in. Stanley has just not really been able to keep up. And Winnipeg's blue line, especially with Morrissey and DeMello struggling, could maybe use a bit of a restructuring. But if there's one pairing that should stay together, I think it's probably Samberg and Pionk. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how they've played this year. Really give me your thoughts on some of the individual Jets I've mentioned in general. Love to hear your thoughts on Connor. Do you love his defensive game? Are you impressed with his two-way play? How do you rate Pionk's turnaround this season? Drop your comments and thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow, we will have a preview ahead of the Columbus game, which Columbus is winning more than I expected. So they're not going to be an easy opponent. Now, kind of like the Wings, I do think the Jets still win, but the Blue Jackets may be peskier than originally thought. I believe this is the Dean Evison era now, so we all remember Evison versus Bones. That was particularly funny. I still think it's one of the greatest GIFs I've ever seen. And I don't know, it just seems like, despite the horrendous tragedy that the Blue Jackets have gone through, they seem, lively. They seem, like they're not letting this stop them from putting on, their best performance in honor of Johnny, in honor of the fan base. And, if you're really needing to root for a team that's not the Jets and you want somebody that just has been through the ringer the last few years and really has gone through all of it, I feel like the Blue Jackets are one of those underdog stories that feels, genuinely worth getting behind. So wishing them all the best on the season. And if they win on Friday, I don't think you could really be upset about that. So curious to know how that goes. But we'll talk about their lineups and what's really worked for this team on tomorrow's episode. But like I said, that's all the time that we have for tonight. As always, thank you so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.